Okay, so Matthew chapter 14, verse 22. You want to hold that? Matthew 14 will begin at 22 in just a minute. So we're continuing our series about Peter. Today we're talking about if you want to walk on water, you got to get out of the boat. All right? So Matthew 22, 23. So, we started this series the first part of the month. We talked about the call of Peter and his brother Andrew and his business partners James and John when Jesus told them to launch out to the deep, and then he was going to make them fishers of men. So we talked about that event in Peter's life and the impact that had on Peter probably more than anything. Then we talked about Peter making the great confession, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus said, "I will build my church upon this rock, and the gates of hell not prevail against it." And then he told Peter, "I'm going to give you the keys to the kingdom." So there's something Jesus sees in Peter that he's working on, trying to transform and to make into something even better. And so last week we looked in Peter's first epistle as we talked about Christ and the church and the cure for our identity crisis. Because Jesus called Peter the rock, he called Peter the stone. That's what Peter means, stone. And upon this rock or this boulder, I'm going to build my church, that being the statement he made, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." But we learn from what Peter writes in this epistle that Jesus is a living stone, but not just any living stone. He's the cornerstone. And the cornerstone is a stone that has to be exactly perfect. Well, we know Jesus was perfect. So Jesus is the cornerstone, and then we are living stones, all built on that cornerstone. Right? So the cornerstone has to be right to make everything else right. All right? And like today, we want to make sure everything is square. Well, the way they squared up everything was measuring it by that cornerstone. Everything had to be perfect. But being those living stones, we're not just stones in this building of God's house, but we're a chosen people. We are a royal priesthood, a holy nation, and a people for God's own possession. We're important. He gives us meaning and purpose in our life when we belong to Jesus Christ. So today we want to look at another very important event in Peter's life. And that was the night that Peter went walking on the water. See, there are many events in the life of Jesus where Jesus takes time to teach Peter and the other disciples, but this chapter 14 is one of those important moments in Peter's life that teaches him some very important lessons and teaches us some very important lessons. Now, what we have to know as we think about the background leading up to this, John the Baptist had been beheaded. John was Jesus' cousin, and apparently they were close, and they shared the same mission. John was the voice in the wilderness saying, "Prepare the way for the Lord," and Jesus, of course, is the Lord. And so Jesus was naturally upset. He wanted to go away to a desolate place to be alone. And so he told the apostles to get in a boat, and they rowed across the Sea of Galilee to a northern point along the sea where there was nothing except when they got there. There were 5,000 men plus the women and children that had got there before Jesus. Because they saw him going across the sea, they ran around the sea and got to the same place by the time Jesus and the apostles did. Jesus taught an important sermon, and then he fed the crowd with a one little boy's lunch. You know, just some fish and some bread. One little boy's lunch. The way I like to put it so we can understand it, 2 sardines and 5 saltine crackers. So what it amounted to. Jesus fed a multitude with that amount of food. Great miracle. Then he sent the disciples on ahead of him across the shore. He sent the crowd away, and he went up into the mountains to pray. That's the background. And we need to understand what happens as the disciples are in the boat going across the sea. So let's start with a building storm. You see, verse 22 through 24 says this. And immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side while he sent the crowds away. And after he sent the crowds away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. And when it was evening, he was there alone. But the boat was already a long way from the land, battered by waves, for the wind was contrary. Okay, so it's not going to be a simple trip back across the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee at the widest point is only 7 miles wide. So it's not a humongous sea. It is basically a lake, is what we're looking at. And it's not a very wide lake. It should have only taken them maybe a couple of hours to row from the point where they were back to their destination. Okay? But now it's become a struggle. Verse 24, the boat was a long way from the shore. Well, John helps us to understand about where they were. In John's Gospel, chapter 6 and verse 19, it says, when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles. About 3 or 4 miles. So, what you get the picture? That where they are is in the middle of the lake. In the middle of a lake, in the middle of a storm. And there's no way to turn around because you're in the middle of the lake. Your destination is as close as where you started from. So here they are, literally, in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, in the middle of a storm that would be equivalent to a nor'easter or a hurricane. That's the kind of storm they're in, right? And the waves are battering the boat. They're struggling. They're struggling. That word battling means pain, toil, torment. They're struggling hard. And if you've ever been out on a lake, when a storm comes up, you know it's not a pleasant thing. But to be in a rowboat in the middle of a storm had to be even worse. All right? So think about it. So these are some big waves that are crashing up against the boat, battling the boat. It's taking them a whole lot longer than expected because think about it. Jesus sent them away before he sent the crowd away. So it's before dark that they left. Should have only taken a couple of hours to get across the lake to where they were going. But now it's been a long time and they're a long way. How long has it been? Well, it says in the scriptures in Matthew 14:25, it's the 4th watch of the night. The 4th watch of the night. Now, the Romans divided time into watches. So the 4th watch of the night is between 3 and 6 o'clock in the morning. Now, they left before dark. And here it is sometime between 3 and 6 in the morning, and they're still sitting in the middle of the sea battling the storm. And it seems like Jesus is a long ways away. I mean, where is he? Here they are fighting the storm. And Jesus went up on a mountain to pray. It'd be interesting to know exactly what he was praying. And we don't know exactly what he was praying. But I can almost guarantee you he was praying for those 12 men in that boat. Because he had some important lessons he wanted to teach. And where he taught those 12 men the most and the best was in the middle of that sea. So here they are in the middle of this terrible storm, in the middle of the lake, battling these terrible waves, and the wind was against them, so it made it even harder to row the direction they wanted to go. Terrible storm. So think about what these men are going through. And how would you feel if you were in their situation? I've been out on the water in the middle of a storm. It's not fun by any means. But thank the Lord for motors to help you get somewhere rather than depending on the wind and oars to get you moving. All right? But think about them and the events of the day. Think about how tired they must have already been. I mean, it's a draining time. Very emotional time with the loss of somebody important to the Lord Jesus Christ. Feeding that multitude, and what all went through there, and now they're trying to get across the sea, and they're fighting a storm, and they're fighting the waves, and they're fighting the wind. Think about how tired they were. How exhausted they must have been. You're not getting anywhere. You ever had that feeling? You're just not getting anywhere. And the storm is strong. But we come to verse 25. And 25 through 27 it says this. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke, saying, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." Now get the picture. I tried to paint the picture how exhausted and tired they already are. So get that picture. And it's 3 to 6 o'clock in the morning. So it's dark. It's very dark. Maybe the moon's shining a little bit through the clouds, and they see something walking towards them on the water. Their first explanation is, it's a ghost. Now, think about it. You're already exhausted. You're out in the middle of the sea. You're in the middle of this terrible storm, and you see something you can't explain. You'd be afraid too. Now, they weren't just afraid, they were terrified. All right? They were terrified. I mean, they're not expecting Jesus. Because they're expecting Jesus to be where they're going to land the boat. They're not expecting Jesus to come across there. I mean, what would we think if we were in their position? I'd probably think maybe there is such a thing as ghosts walking across the water here as well. All right? But Jesus says, take courage. It's I. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. As we look at this picture, we're amazed at the fact that the Lord could walk on that water in the midst of that storm. But He is the Lord of creation, right? So why not walk on the water? That's not the amazing thing that's in this story, that He's walking on the water. But note this. Nothing could keep Jesus from His disciples. Not the wind, not the waves, not the storm. Jesus is going to His disciples. in the midst of all of their struggling, there is no reason to fear because nothing can keep God from us. If we belong to Christ, He's with us. He's helping us. And it doesn't matter what your storm might be, He's there. All right? No reason for fear, because faith should always overcome fear. All right? So now let's think about the next event. So look at verse 28 and 29. And Peter said to him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. And he said, come. And Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. Now, I want you to put yourselves in the position of the disciples again for a minute. You're in the midst of the storm. You see this thing, you're not sure what it is, but you learn it's Jesus. What would be the first thing you would ask Jesus to do? I know what I would say. Hey, Lord, can you stop this storm? They've seen Him do that before. So, yeah, can you just say, hey, peace be still, and put this storm at rest? But they didn't ask that. Or you might say, hey, Jesus, you might want to get in this boat. It's a little safer in the boat than it is out there on the water. But they didn't say that. I want you to notice what Peter did say. All right? Peter says, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. Now, I want you to pay attention here. Peter often gets a bad rap with this story. A lot of people call Peter brash, impulsive, always seeking something for himself. But I want you to look at this in a totally different light, because I think Peter gets the bad end of the deal so many times. First of all, something about this statement Peter made we got to understand. He said, Lord, if it is you, command me to walk on the water. And that's what the English translation says, correct? However, something we need to note, and that is this. The construction of that sentence in the Greek can read this way. Lord, since it is you, command me to come to you on the water. Now, does that change the whole concept of the story? If kind of indicates doubt. Since kind of indicates faith. So many people were saying Peter was doubting that it was Jesus. After studying this thing out carefully this week, I think Peter believed it was Jesus and asked Jesus to let him come to him on the water. Now, that's a rather bold idea. But faith in Christ sometimes has to get out of the boat and to try to do something that seems to be impossible. You know, Peter could have thought, there's no way I could walk on this water. I mean, look at the wind, look at the waves. There's no way I certainly wouldn't want to try it. You know? The other disciples didn't say anything about walking on the water. Who has more faith? Peter said, Lord, since it's you, let me come to you on the water. But this is what he continued to say. But you commanded. Because see, faith understands something. You don't act upon anything that is not a command of the Lord. You don't walk on the water because you want to. You walk on the water because God commanded you to. And Jesus said, Peter, come on. Come on and walk to me on the water. Now, how far did he walk? I've always wondered that. But I've come to the conclusion that he walked far enough away from the boat that there was no easy way to get back to it. Some people think he just got out of the boat and he sank. I don't think that. I think he walked on the water to Jesus because he had his eyes focused on Jesus. All right? So, why did he say that? Why did he want to get out of the boat and get to Jesus? Well, simply because of this. And if you look at Peter's life, you'll see this. Peter wanted to be as close to Jesus as possible. Why would I say that? Well, think about other events in Peter's life. Think about the night Jesus was crucified. Now, who among the apostles were present when Jesus went to those trials? We know John was there. But John was kin to the high priest, so he got inside the house. He was invited in. Peter was there in the courtyard. That's a little bit different situation than John was in. John was kin to the high priest. Okay, no big deal. I'll go in the house. I got nothing to worry about. Peter was in the courtyard. People he didn't know. Now, did he mess up? Yeah, he did. He denied the Lord 3 times. We're going to look at that story probably in a couple of weeks. All right? He messed up. But I want you to note something. He was there. Yeah, he made his mistakes. We're not going to excuse that. But what I want to give him credit for is he was there. Because where's the other 10? They're nowhere around. Give Peter some credit, what credit's due. Or another story that shows that Peter always wants to be as close to Jesus as possible. Think about after Jesus' resurrection. The disciples were told to go to Galilee where they'd meet Jesus, and they went to Galilee. And of course, when they go to Galilee, well, there's the Sea of Galilee, and they're fishermen. So what are they doing? They're fishing. So it's early in the morning. It's about sunrise, because they did their fishing at night. Early in the morning, about sunrise, there's a figure on the shore they don't recognize. Again, they're not expecting to see Jesus at this point. They're fishing. And the voice from the shore called and said, hey, cast your net on the other side. And they caught a large catch of fish. Okay, there's a big parallel to that story and the first story we used in this series. Okay, we'll get into that more when we get to this story in particular. But John told Peter, it's the Lord. Now, what happens next? Peter jumps in the water and swims to shore. Now, wouldn't it have been a lot easier just to stay in the boat and row the boat to shore? But he didn't wait for the boat to get to shore. He jumped in the water and swam to Jesus. Peter always wanted to be as close to Jesus as he could be. I think we need to understand that about Peter. And we need to understand there's something Jesus saw in Peter that he wanted to transform him into someone great in his kingdom. Okay? So Peter always wanted to do that. But what we got to understand is that now Peter is out of the boat and he's walking by faith on the water. Now, it would have been a lot simpler to stay in the boat and say, hey, come on, Jesus, get in the boat. Sit here right beside of me. That would have been simpler. But he didn't say that. Hey, I want to come to you. That's where we all should be, right? We always want to come to Jesus. Come to Jesus. All right? So faith that walks on water doesn't pay attention to obstacles. They've been battling that wind and the waves all night long. But Peter said, Lord, command it that I come to you. And Jesus said, come on. And he got out and he walked on the water despite the wind and despite the waves. He didn't say, I can't. He got out of the boat and did what was commanded. All right? So, again, Peter's the only one who gets out of the boat. No, the rest of them do. But then, something happens. So start at verse 30 and we'll read through 33. But seeing the wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and took hold of him and said to him, You of little faith, why did you doubt? And when they got into the boat, the wind stopped, and those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, You are certainly God's Son. Peter began to sink. Now why? If Peter had all this faith, why did he sink? The scripture says, because he saw the wind. Well, the wind didn't matter at first, did it? The waves didn't matter at first, did they? No, but now Peter's walking towards Jesus and he sees the wind. Well, we know you can't see the wind, but you can always see the effects of the wind, right? Those waves were an effect of the wind. So maybe what happened, maybe one of those waves lifted Peter up and Jesus went down and Peter couldn't keep his eyes on Jesus. And when he took his eye off of Jesus, he began to sink. When he took his eyes off of Jesus, he began to sink. You see, we got to keep our eyes focused on Jesus. At all times, we have to keep our eyes focused on Jesus. Think about when temptation comes and you give in. What happened? You took your eyes off of Jesus. We're all guilty of it. Right? We got to keep our eyes on Jesus. We have to understand Hebrews 12, 1 through 3. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. When we begin to focus on anything other than Jesus, we're going to sink. Your problems come along. There's temptations. There's worldly influences. There's ungodliness. There's a daily struggles that we all go through. It's not hard to lose heart. But in the moment that we begin to doubt, we're going to sink. In that moment, Peter forgot who was the most powerful. The wind and the waves the most powerful? Or was it the one who created the wind and the waves? See, sometimes we forget that. And we can't. The point is this: when doubt enters, faith departs. We have no room for doubt. None at all. And so Jesus rebukes Peter when he says, "You of little faith." You of little faith. Think about it. Peter's faith was stronger than the rest of them because the rest of them were still in the boat. Peter got out, and Peter walked on the water, but he let doubt enter into the picture. So Jesus rebukes Peter to help the other disciples see that a consistent confidence in Jesus is what is absolutely necessary. And we need to remember that. A consistent confidence in Jesus is what is absolutely necessary. Now, there's one more thing about this story we got to notice. We can't end without this. When Peter was picked up by Jesus out of the water and they got into the boat, the storm ceased. It was calm on the Sea of Galilee. Now, what does all of that mean? Jesus was in charge of this storm the whole time. Did Jesus pray for the storm? Possibly. To be able to teach his apostles an important lesson. Keep your eyes focused on Jesus. That's a lesson. So if you want to walk on the water, you got to get out of the boat, but you got to keep your eyes on Jesus at all times. All right? So, Peter was being transformed and developed. You know, sometimes hard things come our way because God has a lesson to teach us. Don't doubt. Stay focused. And realize Jesus is always with you. He will never leave you, and He will never forsake you. So don't think about the circumstances around you. Keep your faith strong. And when you do, faith will always overcome fear. So, how about it today? What's going on in your life? Are you having a storm? Where's your focus? If you need to get your focus figured out, well, there's only one place to focus, and that's on Jesus. So if you're here this morning and you have a decision you need to make for Jesus, won't you come while we stand and sing the song, Jesus Way?